Hello, everyone. And today I'm back with this topic, new era of open source powering DevOps, cloud, and AI. My objective here through these talks is to keep you ahead in the technology curve and also ensure that we catch up with the latest and the greatest, what's happening in the open source world, DevOps, and cloud initiatives alongside AI. So let's quickly get started. I had presented the DevOps Plus as one of my opening talks for 2025. In that talk, I also mentioned the big leap of open source, and I want to dig deeper into the new era of open source, which is powering DevOps, cloud, and now AI. The key questions which we have at hand for 2025 and open source is how will this new era of open source look like? Does open source need to catch up for 2025 and beyond? And why I say so is with AI, cloud, and DevOps movement converging, will AI and emerging technologies craft the new chapter of open source, new chapter of DevOps, and how and what possible opportunities could it bring on the table for the practitioners? What can be possible new ways to contribute to AI-driven open source software? Will vendor-owned open source overpower and continue to define the new path of developer-driven movement? Will take over? Will deep learning models eventually overtake open source development? And lastly, what will be the visionary ideas for overcoming these problems and challenges? Trust erosion, weakening definitions, and rusted licensing models, and open washing to a certain extent. How could we as practitioners play an important role in this? So if you are interested in this session, meet me, Harima Bajpai. I'm the founder for the DevOps Community of Practice here in Canada, which has several chapters, Ottawa, Toronto, Montreal, Edmonton, Atlantic provinces. Producers for the Summits Canada. I'm also the chair for the Master Program at Continuous Delivery Foundation. DevOps Executive of the Year, DevOps Dozen 2023. And I have authored two books on progressive CI/CD, strategizing continuous delivery in cloud, and CI/CD design pattern, which came out December 2024. My call to action is leadership practices and communities. If you want to get in contact with me, my LinkedIn handle as well as my email ID is on the bottom of the slide. So let's quickly get started. And if you have been following me, I often start my talk with basic definitions, foundation layer knowledge. So open source, how it is described is software that comes with permission to use, copy, and distribute, either as is or with modifications that may be offered either free or with charge. The source code must be made available. And this is a definition from Gartner. One of the most widely accepted definitions is from OSI, which approves certain licenses compatible with the definition which they have offer, as well as maintain a list of compliant licenses. New licenses have to be submitted for a formal proposal containing rationale for the license. The open source definition by OSI is the most widely accepted standards for open source software. Providing access to the code is not enough. As per the practitioners, it must allow modification and redistribution under the same terms and all uses including commercial. There is a list of 10 criteria that has to be met to get the approval for the license. Open source license affect the way people can use, study, modify, and distribute software. So now we have some kind of foundation level knowledge about open source and its definition. Let's get going to the next section. And this is something which I was also curious to know the state of open source 2024, 2025. And I rely on Black Duck report, Open Source Security and Risk Analysis Report 2024. According to that report, 96% of the total code base contains open source. 53% of the total code base contains license conflicts. 77% of all code in the total code base originated from open source. 31% of total code base contains open source with no licenses or custom licenses. So there is some work to be done by the practitioners here to ensure that we catch up on the new challenges, the pain points from the past. Like for example, 2.8 years was the mean age of vulnerabilities in the code base assessed for risks. 49% of the code base assessed for risk had components that had no development activities in the last 24 months. And 1% of the code base assessed for risk has components that were at least 12 months behind on the maintainer and the roadmap and the patches and the updates. So clearly it reflects that there is more work need to be done by the practitioners and the leaders in this space. I also would like to highlight some of the possible trends and projecting the possible future with open source in 2025 and beyond. Like, as we mentioned, open source software represents the paradigm that foster collaboration, transparency, and community-driven innovation. It is pretty similar to what we do as DevOps leaders and practitioners, and that is where I find a lot of synergy in driving these kind of changes in the ecosystem. DevOps team often use open source tools and platforms to streamline development workflows and improve efficiency, leading to increased demand of open source services. So this is one of the clear paths, like for practitioners, for leaders, to start looking at open source community contribution if you have not done so in the past. So one of the tasks or one of the goals for you as practitioners for 2025. The global open source service market is expected to reach 83.8 billion USD by 2030, growing at a rate of 16.9% from 2023 to 2030, according to a new report by Grandview Research Inc. So there has been some notable civil shift in how open source practitioners approach open source software and technology. They are also becoming more and more popular in traditional businesses or conventional businesses and organizations where they are looking to cut costs, reduce vendor lock-in, and increase flexibility. There has been a noticeable trend also in adopting certain licenses. So permissive licenses, for example, in contrast with copyleft licenses, particularly for those from the GPL family. Permissive licenses impose minimal restrictions on software users, allowing them to incorporate the software into proprietary applications without disclosing the source code. But if you have been following like the growing trends in 2024, you could also argue on this, because on contrary, single vendor driven OSS projects are also redefining the OSS space by continuously reverting to restrictive licenses like business source licenses. So there is a lot of evolution which is planned or which is in action for 2025. One of the top consideration for 2025 is late stage capitalism for open source projects. Consequence, open source projects are moving to a more restrictive model, but the current wave started arguably, like you can argue on this, but I feel that HashiCorp in August 2023 decided to pull Terraform, for example, and subsequently other products like Nomad back from open source world and assigning them to business source license version 1.1. The open source AI dilemma also is in place. In a company blog post on December 26, OpenAI stated its intention to transform for from a for-profit and a non-profit structure to a public benefit corporation, like rivals Anthropic and XAI. So obviously, we see a lot of changes in the license model. License risk. So 31% of 2023 audited code base were using code which was either no discernible license or customized licenses, as we spoke earlier. Open source security by a risk analysis report 2024 highlights that. So there will be some action and some work needed to be done in this space, and I will highlight some of the key initiatives in my next slides. Protecting against security and IP compliance risks introduced by AI coding tools. So we are also in 2025 see a lot of regulatory compliance and um, action on how the AI assisted code, for example, will be kind of deployed, distributed, as well as used. Improve maintenance practices. I mean, it goes needless without saying, if you have been watching out the open source, practitioners as well as open source projects, there has to be some work done in that space and updating open source definition to be relevant for cloud. It has been a debate since a long time now, and probably it's time we can, take this in 2025 and have some kind of consensus on how we make progress on that space. So these problems which we have or these pain points or challenges which we have outlined in the previous slide, it also is reflecting one of the bigger challenges, that the value of open source software. And it is difficult to measure the value of open source software due to non-pecuniary nature and lack of centralized usage tracking. And the supply side value of widely used OSS is accounted for $4.15 billion, but the demand side value is much larger. It is accounted for $8.8 trillion. And this is a paper from the Harvard Business School, and I have a link at the bottom of this slide, which was presented by a couple of well-known industry practitioners. Firms would need to spend at least 3.5 times more on software than they currently do if OSS did not exist. So there is a challenge, obviously, to articulate the value of open source software in a business ecosystem because of the decentralized nature of software onboarding and the contribution being made. However, it also poses some different challenges around how do we fulfill the strategic gaps which we have highlighted in a couple of slides before. There are other areas of improvement as well. From an economic standpoint, we also looked at like how difficult it is to um, assess the value of open source software. It is also from an operational and governance perspective. There are some triggers which will shape up open source software and technology and help in filling up the strategic gaps in 2025 and beyond. So 2024 State of Open Source report highlighted some of the operational pain points. 79% of the open source software struggle with maintaining security policies. 42% have difficulty maintaining end-of-life versions. 40% lack high-level technical support. 38% lack of skill, experience, proficiency of their teams, and 34% experience issues with installation upgrades and configurations. So if you look at the pain points, it would also give rise to new companies, new business models, new ways of contributing to open source software. Operational and governance practices, from visibility of open source in use to managing and maintaining the open source workflows, everything would need governance. And foundations like Cloud Native Computing Foundation, Apache Software Foundation, Linux Foundation has played an important role. However, more has to be done in this area. There are many other foundations which are working towards enabling this change. Now we also will talk about some other active areas of engagement for you in 2025. So one of the areas which we see is active contribution and funding, and open source software technology would need that. The era of GitHub stars and emojis is nearly coming to an end. Large-scale adoption of open source would mean for a systematic funding pipeline and a payback model. So we will see a lot of, attraction and action on how to enable that change. Open source licenses, we have talked about that. There are many ecosystem triggers for reevaluating the sustainability of open source licensing, as is last minute survival triggers, lack of contributions, distribution models, service models offered by cloud providers, changing competitive landscape, ethical sourcing, or fair source are the new buzzwords in the community. And lastly, I would say open source and AI. Intersection of open source and AI has resulted in disruptive ideas, led to a big divide in the community. OSI, while working to define open source AI, realized that data governance is an unresolvable issue right now. The OSI's work on open source AI definition provides a starting point, but there are parallel tracks with other similar initiatives and gaps between open source, closed source, and the gaps and the boundaries are overlapping. In some cases, it's also shrinking. So there is not a one view or one opinion on this whole, how this ecosystem will evolve. And this will be one of the main areas of action for 2025. Now, we talk about some changes from a license perspective, because one of the key changes or revolutionary or evolutionary areas which I see is coming from this perspective as well. Like, history reminds us, like MongoDB was a notable early mover from an open source license to a source and available license. The BSL license, business source license, is a unique source license available created by MariaDB for applications to its products, and it was also adopted by other companies. Elastic also announced that it was updating the licenses of portions of Elasticsearch and Kibana from ASL v2 to a dual license structure, Elastic License v2 um, version 2. Elastic made a move back to open source by announcing in August 2024 that is adding to AGPL v3 as a third licensing option. So there is a lot of thinking behind how to tackle the cloud movement, how to bring more contributions, also ensuring that the value of the open source projects remain intact, right? Lastly, we have also discussed HashiCorp. HashiCorp stirred up significant controversy by transitioning the licensing of its products, notably Terraform, from the Mozilla public license version v2 to a vCopyleft license to a BSL license in August 2023. And it also led to spinning off a new open source project. So obviously, we see a lot of forward thinking or progressive thinking about how to tackle this license challenge. We have also heard about some new initiatives. Fair source initiative, for example. Fair source definition is a fair source is an alternative to closed source, allowing you to safely share access to your core product. Fair source software is publicly available to read, allow use, modification, redistribution with minimal restrictions to protect the producer's business model, and undergo delayed open source publication. Delayed open source publication, or DOSP, is a practice of distributing and publicly deploying software under a proprietary license at first, and then subsequently and in planned fashion, publishing that software source code under an open source license. Fair Source began as an initiative of Century in 2024 in response to a 2023 call to action from co-founder Adam Jacob of Chef. Fair Source is managed on GitHub, and governance and the process model and all the documentation is available to read. I have the link on the slide. There is another alternative path, which is ethical sourcing, and how open source will evolve to an ethical source. So organizations for ethical source, OES, is a non-profit public charity focusing on ethical outcome in open source and other public interest technologies. The leading ethical source license, HL3, features a modular structure that lets open source communities customize the license to reflect their particular values. Ethical licensure incubator also supports development of other ethical source licenses as similar to what OSI has done, including at the root anti-racist license currently under development by software engineer and OES member Don Wages. So the work is volunteer based and member driven. So you can check out these two initiatives. Also, open source AI. We have talked about open source AI. Open source AI is an AI system made available under terms in a way that grants freedom to use the system of any purpose without having to ask for permission. Study on how the system works and inspects its component, modify the system for any purposes, including a change in its output, and share the system or for others to use with or without modification for any purpose. There is also, definition challenge when we talk about open and open source models. So a lot of confusion has been created around that. So open model features free access to the model weights, but terms of use, redistribution, and variant ownership vary according to models' specific term of use, which may not be based on an open source license. And there are other like terminologies which are in making or which is also kind of point of consideration is open model we talked about, right? Open source models, then open source libraries and frameworks, and open source data sets. So there is a definite challenge in how the open source community will evolve and integrate AI into its you know systems. I also found this very interesting that, how is the role of foundations changing? And again, there are a lot of foundations which have supported open source software in the past. Many of them are very well known, like OSI, for example. We all know about Apache Foundation. We know Eclipse Foundation. We know of Mozilla Foundation. And we also know, like Cloud Native Foundation, CNCF. We have Linux Foundation, who has different foundations in its umbrella purview. So how these foundations operate, and what kind of change we can see from an open source foundation perspective. So foundations have supported this open source movement from the beginning. So they support not only the development governance, the technology roadmaps, but also how you can become a contributor to all these foundations, and also ensure that you have an active role to play in how the open source movement is kind of shaping up. They have a certain set of guidelines, forums, they have like mailing list, they have rules on how to kind of becoming a committer, how do you get involved in development governance and technical governance. So there's a lot of work which has already been done, but I feel that there will be more work which will be needed to evolve open source technology, software technology from here in 2025. So the role of foundations also will evolve. And if you have not looked at any of these foundations or open source projects, I think it's time for you as a practitioner, as a leader, to get engaged and define the evolutionary changes for the future. I've also spoken about like projecting the possible future with open source and how the talent and the contributor pipeline would look like. So there has been a substantial debate on localized open source and not, and this is again demystifying what we are suggesting here. So localized open source is not local source. And the open source software community is witnessing a remarkable surge in adoption across developing countries. And this localized open source is reflecting that change. The trend is driven by the need of cost-effective, scalable solutions that can be tailored to local needs. With 80% of the companies reporting increase in utilization of open source technologies over the past year, it empowers local developers to contribute to global projects. And that is the essence of localized open source. So we are not talking about local source here. The second aspect is AI-driven open source projects. So the integration of AI and ML into open source software will also bring significant changes. And there has been a lot of kind of action on how to integrate AI and ML in OSS tools, not just a trend, but also transformation and offering at times either completely new capabilities or new ways to contribute. Cross industry support and sponsorship. So we have seen that interest in open source technology, software technology is growing. So cross industry partnerships have become a hallmark for open source software community, and more companies are joining forces to leverage open source technology. Community to commercialization. We have talked about a little bit in the past about the business model, the license model for open source, and how the support models or service models will mature in 2025 and beyond. So the developer-driven growth is on the cards. So developer-driven evolution of commercial models for open source um, means that we are coordinating organic growth of an open source project and leading to enterprise sales with a business view in mind. And there will be some new roles in the open source community associated with this movement. So obviously, this last attempt to survive, or last attempt for survival and capitalism, kind of will fade away once we have strong, committed, community leaders who can evolve and put some kind of transformation thinking around commercialization of the community-driven software projects. Projecting the possible future also would mean that how would the new roles change or grow or evolve. So I have spoken on this in the last talk as well. I see that there will be expansion of open source program offices that bring new job opportunities. If you have not seen the OSPO plus plus, that is where a lot of community members and collaborative open source program offices are coming together to support the core mission and objective, and helping universities, government, and civic institutions through open source collaboration. And there is a reference link in the slide if you're interested in that. Open source implementers and advisors. With this whole change happening as we speak, to support practical and action-oriented approach that helps address the nuances, challenges of open source software adoption within, let's say, public sector or government or non-conventional institutions, there will be a rise in open source implementers role and as well as advisors. Open source software desk, a new segment of professionals ensuring a smooth user experience and enhancing collaboration with open source project communities. And lastly, open source academy, building OSS skills, awareness, setup of community of practice for organizations, public sector, and policymakers. And lastly, I would highlight that if you're curious and you want to get started with your open source, initiatives for 2025, I mean, I was looking at some of the beginners projects for kids, because I feel that, it will be a great start for the young technologists. So Scratch, for example, it's a beginner kind of an open source area or a playground, and it's a very popular programming languages with kids. So if you want your younger generation to be part of this movement, why don't you look at this open source movement? Also, code dojos and hackathons, community-led workshops, and these are places where people meet with a common interest. I would also try to kind of ensure that we have invested as a community of practitioners in this space in 2025. We are bringing up DevOps for AI as a hackathon in Ottawa as one of the ambitious series of hackathons which we want to do in the next few years. SIG and community-driven projects, non-project community-driven engagements led by men and maintained by volunteers. Those, if you are interested to contribute to your first open source, initiative, you can look at SIGs and contribution community-driven projects. One of the recent SIGs, which has been, opened as a new initiative in Condensed Living Foundation, you can look at that. It was announced on January in the first week of January. There are many other ways how you can contribute and how do you build an open source community. There are many practitioners who have already advocated for that. So I have some links for you if you are interested to kind of dig deeper into this area. With that, I would like to say stay tuned for more such content. Leadership in the age of AI is critical, and leaders play an instrumental role in effective governance strategies, building upon evolutionary changes, and various pillars like evolving roles, evolving operating models. So, I will start to talk more about these evolutionary aspects and how leaders could contribute to all this evolutionary changes, and how do we bring up more ideas or brainstorm more ideas in this space. So stay tuned for my next talk. Meanwhile, if you're interested, join the community of practice, as well as join the open source movement by ensuring that you have a voice at the table for 2025. Thank you very much for spending this time with me, and stay tuned for more.